Welcome to Zen-Brain. This is really a platform that we've created to talk about emotional and mental health. And I stress upon the word emotional. And this we do through personal stories, of course. You'll see many such videos on our platform if you scroll through the video section. We put a lot of emphasis on scientific research, particularly cognitive behavioral research, research in the area of epigenetics. You'll find many such discussions on our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm excited to discuss something I have been working on for a while now, which is the connection really between our thoughts, emotions, and the release of hormones and neurotransmitters in our brain and body. When we feel happy and excited, it causes happy chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins to be released in our brain and body. And what happens when we are stressed? Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are released. And I want to specify here, not all stress is bad. Some really thrive in it. In fact, some people are motivated by stress. It helps them, but some people aren't. And in such people, when there is prolonged stress, there is also excessive release of hormones like cortisol, which may, and I want to specify again, which may lead to a chemical locha or chemical imbalance in the body and brain. And that's why doctors, particularly psychiatrists, talk about first restoring this chemical balance that has occurred with medication. Now, let's just give you an instance. My friend Dheeraj has been diagnosed with a bad bout of depression. Due to depression, Dheeraj's serotonin levels may have fallen. And because of low levels of serotonin, it makes him feel worse, more low, and it becomes like this vicious cycle. And researchers have actually found that when a person is depressed, it causes serotonin levels to fall up to 50%. Doctors at this point may prescribe antidepressants for Dheeraj to restore this chemical balance in his brain. Now, antidepressants like SSRIs, that is serotonin reuptake inhibitors, prevent serotonin from leaving or escaping the cell so that serotonin remains in the brain and can carry out its function of mood lifting. And that's why restoring chemical balance is as important as therapy or going to a psychologist. And to further help us understand this intricate connection between our thoughts and emotions and how they impact our hormones and neurotransmitters, and therefore our physical health and behavior, here is Dr. Sanjeev Jain from Nimhans, that is the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bengaluru. I'm a big fan of his. He's a professor of psychiatry, especially mood disorders, and has been part of a lot of research in the area of genetics and psychiatric disorders and epigenetics. In fact, that's how we were introduced to this whole concept of epigenetics. What is epigenetics, you might ask? It's the study of how our environment and behavior affect how our genes work. Epigenetic changes do not cause changes in the DNA sequence of our genes per se, but it definitely affects how our genes behave. And this is connected with what we are going to be talking about today, how, for instance, prolonged bad stress leads to excessive production of the stress hormone cortisol in our body, and it literally impacts the way our genes begin to behave. And that's why prolonged stress also affects our mental health and physical health. Dr. Jain, thank you very much for joining us on Zen-Brain.
Pleasure.
So it's all interconnected, isn't it, Doc?
Yes, it is a web. It is a very, very intricate web of being, of consciousness, of biology, webs, metaphorical, physical, and actual wiring. So it is a web, and I first, as psychiatrist and neuroscientist, is to unravel these connections and see how we can help people cope better with these problems.
Let me start with a very, very basic question, Doc. Could you explain to us very simply, what are hormones and neurotransmitters for especially those who are not familiar with the medical jargon? Sure. And what is the role that they play, really?
So hormones and neurotransmitters basically serve to transfer information and regulate growth and development at different points in life. So hormones are slow acting. They circulate through the blood. They change the organ. They change the propensity of the organ to do things. And if they are deficient, various diseases occur, like thyroid disease. So thyroid is essential for maintaining the body. Cortisol is essential for managing stress. The growth hormone is essential for gaining height. Insulin is necessary for regulating sugar. And diseases of these hormones like diabetes, thyroid disease, excessive tallness or dwarfness are hormone-related stuff. They are critical during development. They are critical for sexual development, but they are also critical for maintaining the body well. Now, this is a slow-acting process, and for minute-to-minute variation, we have a nervous system. The nervous system will act through neurotransmitters, which act in millisecond range. So electrical impulse arrives, the light is switched on, your retina lights up, it sends some chemicals back to your brain, and you see the things around you. All these are very fast electrical come chemical reactions. Many synapses are electrical, many synapses are chemical. The ones that we talk about mainly are the chemical synapses. The ones which are regulated, for example, in epilepsy, are often the electrical synapses. We still don't know how these two merge together in the brain, but there are some. Even dopamine or serotonin has some electrical synapses and some chemical synapses. So it's a very complex interaction between these two. This itself is a very recent development. Till the 50s and 60s, we didn't know what synapses were. We didn't know what neurotransmitters were. Norepinephrine, serotonin, acetylcholine were all discovered in the middle of the 20th century. Before that, we had no idea how the brain actually works. And it's only in the last 50 years or so that we understand how these chemicals regulate the brain. So like any routine chemistry reaction, neurotransmitter is released from one end of a synapse, which is the connecting point between the two nerves. It is released, it binds to the second nerve, transmits the information to the second nerve, and on it goes. So it's a chain of neurotransmitters. But since it is chemical and electrical, it has to be switched off. And switching off is by the same neurotransmitter being taken back into the circuit. It's like switching electric on and then having a plug to draw the electricity back. So how do you switch it off is as important as how you switch it on. And regulating this on-off states is a whole series of transmitter receptors, reuptake, recycling, blah, blah, blah. There are components in the cell which handle this on-off situation. It's the balance between the on and off which decides mood states. So if you cause it to be permanently off with certain chemicals, like some of the drugs used in blood pressure, like Rauwolfia, Sarpagandha in Unani and Ayurvedic medicine, can cause severe depression because it depletes the brain of neurotransmitters. So very severe depression results. But in the routine depressions that we see, the idea is that this balance as to how long and how much to switch on and off is somehow disturbed. So that the signaling that is happening in the brain is very subtly altered. In the synapse, we can sometimes detect, if we are lucky, evidence of the wrong kind of persistence of serotonin or dopamine. And if we correct that with medicines, it seems to correspond to the recovery from depression. But all these insights are only 30 to 40 years old, and we are still understanding this in more detail. We have no idea where the problem starts. Do emotions produce this change in sensitivity? Is the sensitivity producing the emotion change? Is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail? We don't have a full idea because as we all know, depression is something that develops over weeks and months, over a lifetime, and many events contribute to this. And that's why the role of epigenetics and genetics becomes so important. We are working on the genetics of mood disorder, but it turns out that even though there's a family history, even though there is a genetic makeup, not all people get depressed. How does stress, how does propensity or a risk of depression translate when a person faces stress? Therefore becomes an important question. That's where genetics, epigenetics, et cetera, are now coming into play to understand how depression or how mood disorders work.
What you're saying is it's a chicken and egg situation. You don't know whether it came from the chemical imbalance itself or the mood disorders have caused the chemical imbalance. Is that right?
Absolutely.
What could be some reasons for, say, for instance, it started with this chemical Locha? Could it be genetics? Could it be the environment? Could it be some other medication that they are having? What could be the reasons?
It can be all of the above. Why? Because the genetics of it is pretty impressive, especially for things like bipolar mood disorder, recurrent unipolar depression. The inheritance risk is reasonably high, almost as high as hypertension or diabetes, or even more. So that if you have a twin with a bipolar illness or recurrent severe depression, there's almost 50 to 60% chance that the other twin will also get it. When it comes to the general population or further away in the family, the risks come down, but everybody, like a mental health survey showed, around 8% of the population is feeling low at any given point of time. So that becomes an important thing to understand. There's a risk in the entire population, and environmental events or stresses put some people slightly closer to the edge or over the edge, which is what we call clinical depression. What is the gene and what is the genetic contribution, what is the environmental contribution can vary from person to person. It can be 75-25 in one case and 25 and 75 in the other case. But ultimately, these risks need to be understood as being additive and interactive rather than absolutes. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing called a pure genetics and a pure environment. It's always interactive. Now, with medicines and with drugs of abuse, risks of depression can also get altered by that. So diabetes, for example, is often accompanied by symptoms of anxiety or palpitation in the early stages. Thyroid disease has high rates of depression. Rates of depression rise in women post-menopause. Most of the young onset depressions begin at 15 to 25, which is again around the time of puberty and adulthood. So there are periods of life when hormonal fluctuations will increase risk of depression. We have the whole issue of postpartum blues and postpartum psychosis, which is obviously related to the hormonal changes produced by pregnancy. So there is a hormonal substrate, there is a genetic substrate, there's a neurotransmitter substrate. And as doctors, we have to figure out in a given person, what is the relative contribution of each.
There is no perfect balance that is prevalent across a population. It's all individual, right, isn't it? So yes, my balance would be completely different from, say, yours or somebody else's. And we have to figure out what our levels of balance is, really. Is that right?
That's right in a qualified way. I mean, after all, there are no two people who look alike. That is a diversity. Mm-hmm. So why should there be two people who think alike or feel alike? Our minds are likely to be as diverse as our faces. Mm-hmm. So there is an inherent diversity or variation in all our emotional responses, just like our faces and our bodies vary from each other. However, we do realize that there are extreme situations in bodily function and similarly in mental function, which increase the risk of certain things. We know that people who are, for example, exceptionally tall can have more chance of lung disease or heart disease because the blood vessels have to work for much longer distance. Simple. There's nothing more to it. So so these variations occur. Similarly, there may be variations in our mental makeups. Mm-hmm. Some people are inherently more worrying. Some people are inherently more risk-taking, what we call externalizing symptoms. Some people are very cautious in their interactions. So each one of those may add a risk factor to the ultimate disease, but these temperaments are likely to be as hardwired as our physical appearances are in terms of genetics. And therefore, basically all animals inherit a particular repertoire of behavior, which is very necessary for the species to survive. So you have to have times when you're anxious, you have to have times when you're afraid, you have a time when you feel happy, you have a time when you have to feel joy and camaraderie. This is all part of life of all animals, including human animals, except that we made it slightly more complex. But these processes are pretty hardwired in all life forms.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you one thing before we actually move on to specific, hormones. You were talking about hardwiring and you were talking about temperament. Do you think in your research, it is possible for somebody with a temperament of negativity and somebody who is maybe bordering depression to actually change their temperament over the course of a few years? Is it actually possible?
Of course, it is possible. So one must realize that what I'm calling hardwiring is inherently, very strictly, what happens before you were born. So the moment the child is born, the child is now exposed to new stimuli. And how the brain that's the reason why, for example, mammalian primates have such a prolonged childhood, because the brain is not hardwired at birth. The connections have to develop in response to the environments it faces. And the brain will continuously keep changing and rewiring itself throughout life. It doesn't stop. It's not like a bone that will reach a particular height and then stop. The brain constantly rewires itself. So therefore, it's very important to understand that plasticity, how the brain is maintained, how it changes over lifetime, is a dynamic process. And how we choose what stimuli to give and how to live will change the brain, actually. So temperaments definitely can be altered. I mean, we all heard these stories, the boy is too naughty, send him off to the army, he'll learn some discipline. And he actually goes to the army and becomes a perfect officer because he has learned that discipline. So it does happen. Yeah. I'm not saying send everybody off to the army, but these things do happen, yes. Yeah.
No, you have said this before also, our brains are plastic and we must not ever forget that. And we are constantly working on our neural pathways. And that's why they say when you practice, you become perfect. Anyway, absolutely. I want to quickly touch upon the happy chemicals, dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin, and of course, serotonin. So let's begin with dopamine. Now, just for people who are joining us now, when we are attracted to someone or our pleasure center in the brain is activated and a hormone called dopamine is released in the brain. Dopamine is also released when we eat good food. And the same happens when someone consumes alcohol or takes drug. So, Doc, tell us a little bit about dopamine and what it does really to our brain. And when do we start overproducing this dopamine and what are its after effects then?
So dopamine is a very interesting neurotransmitter. There are 4 or 5 different tracts in the brain which have high amounts of dopamine. Some of them control our movements, like gestures. Some of them control our mood and appetite. Some of them control how we see. There are dopamine receptors in the eye. And then there are dopamine receptors scattered all over the brain, which control, fine-tune your thinking. Now, dopamine was relatively poorly understood till the 50s, when people found that in a rat, if you put a needle in a particular point of the brain, the rat would keep stimulating itself and starve to death. The pleasure that was being caused by that little needle, which was on the dopaminergic pathways, was enough for it to neglect everything else and focus only on the intense pleasure being caused by dopamine release.
Working in Montreal in the 1950s, James Olds devised a crucial test. He worked out a new way to, in effect, ask animals how they felt.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet. Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on. Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
And a rat wanting brain stimulation would brave a shock stronger than even a starving rat would brave to get food. Human addicts will pay just as high a price for their rewards. In the laboratory,
the fascinating thing was that we found in our laboratory that every single drug that increased sensitivity of the animal to brain stimulation was either an abuse substance or a substance that has potential for abuse.
So that was the famous Olds experiment. And after that, we began to realize what a critical role dopamine plays in the regulation of emotion. Dopamine is a very old chemical. It's not just in humans, it's there in everything around us. The yellow color of bananas is due to dopamine. So it's a very old chemical. It's there in plants and animals. And what it does is it regulates information to other cells, how to behave themselves, how to divide, when to divide, what information to transfer. And in humans, the dopaminergic pathways in the brain, you remember, can't be replaced very fast. Brain cells have to live on for months, years at a time. It's not like the gut or the lung where you change your cells every few days. So brain cells have to last very long. So all these neurotransmitters now have the added responsibility of storing information, of signifying information, so that pleasure or happiness becomes an important marker for remembering what was good and for repeating that. And for doing so, therefore, the occurrence of these kinds of emotional states is a big drive for motivation, is a big drive for memory. And if you, and like all of us, remember the happy moments, that's because for whatever reason, the surge of dopamine corresponded to not just the emotion, but actual plasticity in the brain, so that certain parts of the brain got connected better, which is what formed the memory of the happy event. And all our brains, therefore, are built of these intricate connections, which are memories of all the plus minus neurotransmitter releases that we've experienced. And that's how things go on. Now, dopamine, typically, when the child is born, there are no dopamine type 2 receptors, which are the critical forms that we are talking about. They develop till about 1.5 years, which is when the child actually learns how to walk and run comfortably, which means the motor system is now developed. That's the first level of dopamine. The second level starts developing at puberty, which is hormonal stimulation, and the brain synaptic connections increase by around 15 times, not the cells, but the connections. So that is when you start experiencing different kinds of interest and pleasures and, erotic interests, romantic interests, algebra interests for those who are mathematically inclined, just the joy of doing things well, of motor skills, of learning very skilled movements like sport. All these activities are basically dopamine dependent, induce a certain kind of pressure for emotional drive and emotional happiness. And over time, these start declining. The brain doesn't really realize it, but the peak dopamine number of neurons is between the age of 15 to 25, and then they start dying. And if more than 80% die by the time you're 65, you get Parkinson's disease, which often is preceded by long periods of depression and apathy and things like that. So you can understand dopamine starts building up at birth, peaks at 2 or 3 years for motor, goes up higher at adolescence and early adult, and then starts declining over a lifetime. So at all this time, it serves as the major so-called motivational neurotransmitter. Many drugs that we use in psychiatry, which block dopamine, cause amotivation. So people feel very lethargic, disinterested, apathetic. And the opposite is we try to achieve with the antidepressant drugs. Psychiatry does become an issue of making exactly the right salad for the person. A little bit of this, little bit of that, how to change this chemical in this context. Like I said, we have no idea why this happens, but we know how to set it right. But that's how life is. I mean, when our car breaks down, we don't want to know who invented the wheel. We just want the wheel repaired.
But the thing about dopamine, Doc, and that's why we call it dope, is that you always need more and more to feel that same high, right? And hence, this whole association with addiction and prolonged addiction causes too much of dopamine to be released in the brain, causing, again, what I'm referring to constantly as a chemical locha or chemical imbalance.
Yes.
Now, which, if not treated on time, and I don't know, if can it be treated, may lead to mental illness if it's not treated, right or wrong, Doc?
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. See, one must realize that the gossamer-like web that we have in the brain is very delicately balanced. So exactly the right amount of dopamine must be released, and the same amount must be taken back. It should last only that millisecond. Anything above or below that can cause serious damage. So when one takes, for example, drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, it causes 1,000-fold increase in the amount of dopamine being released in the brain, because that's what these drugs do. They cause a sudden release of dopamine. Now, the brain actually can't handle that. It's like trying to, run an electric motor on a very thin wire. The wire will burst, the wire will fuse. And that's literally what happens. So many of these circuits, because dopamine, to go back to the banana, the reason why bananas turn black is because the dopamine changes into melanin by oxidation, by exposure to the oxygen in the air. But the same thing literally happens in the brain, because the dopamine these cells die off, and you get increased melanization, you get increased problems of dopamine oxidative products, which actually kill the cell itself. Once the cells themselves are dead and this transmission is no longer possible, depression occurs or paranoid schizophrenia occurs. So people who have long-term, by long-term I mean few weeks or few months of amphetamine or cocaine use, are very high risk of schizophrenia. This was picked up in the 1950s when there was an epidemic of amphetamine abuse because of the Second World War, post-Second World War chemicals flooding the market. And people very quickly realized that these chemicals can produce a schizophrenia-like symptoms or prolonged depression. Thankfully, what we've now discovered that at certain points in one's life, I mean, probably below 40, 45, there are stem cells in the brain which can replace these cells, provided they're not too badly damaged. So abstinence and again, some kind of reparative, trying to readjust that chemical locha, whatever you're talking about, does seem to help. So we can manipulate certain of these processes to promote brain resilience and recovery. Mm-hmm. So it can be done, but it takes a long time because the brain to rewire itself takes months. I mean, the high can be minutes, but to repair the damage will last weeks and months. The highs for many of these drugs are instantaneous, but the way the brain rewires itself takes a very long time.
It's important that we have this discussion over and over again, Doc, because a lot of people who are experimenting with drugs perhaps are told not to have them because it's bad for health, but perhaps they don't really know what it does to their brain. And we are reiterating over and over again that this flood of dopamine can, in the long term, cause serious mental illness. So not to take it lightly, to really understand the repercussions that one may have.
Yeah.
Right?
You're absolutely right on that.
I know there's a lot to cover as far as dopamine is concerned, but I want to move on to, the love hormone or the cuddle hormone, oxytocin, produced in the hypothalamus and secreted by the pituitary gland. And oxytocin is released when we hug, touch, or even when we're around someone we like. Why is oxytocin important?
See, oxytocin, progesterone, estrogen, we are all earlier considered to be reproductive hormones. Because they obviously change during pregnancy, during childbirth, and that's where their roles were first identified. It's only in the last 20 or 30 years that you realize that many of these peptides are actually there in the brain also. And in the brain, they seem to be critically important in what we call the limbic system. So the brain is organized in many layers, but conceptually speaking, it can be divided into 3 layers. The very old archicortex, the paleocortex, and the new cortex. That's the neocortex, which is where we think and abstract and learn algebra or learn how to do Zoom interviews. Now, that's a new development in the human primate. And so these levels in the brain are not apart from each other. They each regulate each other. And the limbic system is the one which is supposed to be the so-called emotional backdrop of the brain. It controls the neocortex and controls the behavior to fulfill the emotional needs, which are in a sense hardwired. So things like social togetherness, altruism, love, affection, these are universal needs, perhaps across all animals which live in social networks. And therefore, the need to have something that signals that love becomes very important for that individual brain. And therefore, oxytocin therefore becomes one of those critical chemicals which regulate at a hormonal level how the brain is going to develop, how social cognition is going to develop, how the brain is going to learn what are loved objects, what are not, which are going to make a hierarchy of loved objects. And ultimately, it even boils down to simple Freudian processes. In many countries now, it's very important that the child and the mother, soon after birth, spend as much time possible in skin-to-skin contact, because that whole process produces surges of oxytocin, produces a sense of bonding, both in the mother and the child, which is very necessary for further brain development. So ultimately, it almost becomes like Freud. So the mother-child relationship becomes as important in biological terms as Freud had envisaged in a completely different speculative kind of way. And the remnants of that continue right through. I mean, all of us would have seen, or those of us who have pets will know that pets, for example, develop a very particular affection to new children in the family. And when they have their own children and when they have other children around, their behavior changes because those oxytocin responses are hardwired into most of the mammalian vertebrates that we have around us. So oxytocin levels, for example, rise both in the dog and in the master when they are playing with each other. It's not just human. So it's a very complex way of communicating between nervous systems. I mean, speech is one way, but minds and brains have developed other ways, which are hormone dependent, which are emotion dependent, to directly communicate to each other. A dog presumably doesn't understand what you're actually saying in terms of its language construction. They can understand the affection and they can understand the concern. And those pathways are combination of oxytocin, dopamine, et cetera. So like I mentioned, hormones set the stage for particular things to occur, whereas dopamine, serotonin are the actual events that occur. So the hormones set the stage, and which gives rise to the capacity to respond to dopamine, et cetera, the way they should. So that's why they are so important in producing bonding behavior.
Very beautifully explained, Doc. Bonding sometimes goes beyond speech, and one of the bases may be hormonal. And it brings us back to what we are talking about today, our thoughts, emotion, and the connection that it has with our hormones and neurotransmitters, and how it can also impact our physical health. Is there a difference between men and women as far as hormones are concerned?
Men have testosterone and women have progesterone and estrogen. All fetuses are essentially female sex. And it's only when the testicles develop and they reach the correct position in the growing fetus that they start secreting a hormone, and then that changes back the brain wiring and things like that. So androgenization or estrogenization of the brain is ultimately dictated by the growth of the sex organs in the fetus. Till then, the brains are gender neutral. So there is a default gender neutral position, then there is an effect of the hormones, and then during life, obviously this whole thing is very dynamic because gender roles or gender exposures during early childhood, the onset of puberty, et cetera, will change the way this whole thing works. These were picked up years and years ago, So again, with amphetamine abuse or things like that, children born to mothers who had been using high amounts of amphetamine had temperamental traits which are different. Various biochemical disorders were discovered because the shifting from estrogen to androgen is a very subtle chemical process that can go wrong if you have enzymatic defects. So there can be all kinds of, intersexed by chromosome, by hormone, by organ. So it's so what we call sexuality or gender identity can be controlled by multiple levels of intersection. But given all that, the fact that there's a preoccupation in understanding so-called the gendered brain. Now, whether this is actually true or not is very difficult to understand because the brains are plastic and a lot of our learning happens in very well-defined roles or models of gendered behavior. How would a brain grow up in a gender neutral position is not clearly known, because if you see the diversity of men and women behavior across all cultures, there is enormous diversity. There is no fixed role. So that's one issue. The second issue is the androgen hormones and the estrogen hormones do seem to have different receptors or different pathways in the brain. And the addition of, which is why, in the 40s and 50s, there was all this concern about castrating rapists, because the assumption was that excessive testosterone was producing violent behavior. Now, none of that is actually fundamentally true. So, because we have not been able to show any direct link. Now, we do know that the hormones change temperament. I mean, many women who go through pregnancy will understand that the pregnancy, their mood or their temperament during pregnancy was can sometimes be very different from what it was at other times. So the fact that hormones produce changes in behavior is well known, but whether this is completely dependent on the nature of the hormone is not so clear.
There is an assumption that women tend to be more emotional than men, right? I'm wondering whether there is a correlation with our hormones and the fact that you undergo changes so frequently. There is puberty,
Right.
It's common to both genders,
Right.
but then there is
Cycle.
menstruation,
Right.
pregnancy, and then there is menopause, which
Right.
are different to what men face.
That is a much more tractable issue, because we do know that rates of depression, suicidal ideas, or impulsivity rise during puberty and adulthood. The rates of depression in women show a bimodal peak, with a peak at 15 to 25 and another peak at 45 to 55. So both the onset of hormonal actions and the termination of this regular variation seems to affect. In bipolar mood disorders, we often get menstruation-linked relapses, so that people tend to get more depressed after ovulation and before the next period. So in the second half of the period, there are recurrent patterns of depression, and sometimes advising women to have oral contraceptives for 3 or 4 months so that the hormonal cycle gets stabilized is enough to stop this cycling. So the fact that these hormone cycles have a direct impact on mood is very clear. That again brings back to what I mentioned earlier, that hormones serve as priming agents. They are slow acting and they control brain biology over days, weeks, and months. So it's a pattern of behavior which estrogen and progesterone can make some people prone to. So premenstrual dysphoria, postpartum depression, recurrent depressions can all be linked back to this regular variation in hormone levels that occurs in women between puberty and menopause. In men, we are not sure whether this happens as much. In a very different context, our body goes through, there are layers of regularity. Menstrual cycles, for example, occur on a 28-day cycle. But during the day, there are cycles of steroids, there is a cycle of thyroid, there is a cycle of growth hormone, there is a cycle of prolactin. And all these have to be in synchrony with each other, either in phase or out of phase. And if that disruption is too much, between the hormones themselves, psychological symptoms occur. So that many people realize if they stay awake for more than a night or 2 nights in a row, they feel very low the next day. That's just because the hormone cycle, which sleep and activity produce, have now got disrupted. So your cortisol levels and your thyroid levels and your growth hormone levels are not in sync.
So this is what I'm referring to constantly as chemical locha. And I'm glad you brought up sleep. How much does our sleep affect how healthy we are and our moods and the way our hormones behave, Doc?
So sleep is the royal road, as we all know. So to recovery, to almost everything that we do. So sleep is basically a way for the body to recover from the stress. And it is, again, regulated by a very exquisite balance between norepinephrine and serotonin. So when you fall asleep in stages into deeper and deeper sleep, and then it's interspersed by dreams in which your brain is technically awake, although you're asleep. That is when there is a norepinephrine release in certain parts of the brain, while the rest of your brain is still deeply unconscious. So this resetting of the neurotransmitters in the brain also resets the hormone levels in the brain. So your steroid levels typically are lowest when you wake up, and then they rise by 10 o'clock or something. So as you face the environment, your stress hormones must go up. When you're asleep, they have gone down. So that's a normal steroid cycle. And 30, 40 years ago, people observed that in people who were depressed, this steroid level in the morning tended to be high, obviously showing that there's a fundamental change in the way the neurotransmitters and the endocrine pathways are intersecting with each other. We now know that even the growth hormone or the prolactin levels also circulate during the day, and they are related to how much activity you do. If the sleep is proper, then the brain will go through a cycle of growth hormone release, a cycle of thyroid release, and a low level of steroids, which will provide the best condition for all the long-term repair functions that the hormones are doing to the brain. If that is disrupted, either by using chemicals which will interrupt the dopamine and serotonin, or by just staying awake and being active, then this repairing phase of the brain will not occur properly, and the hormone cycles themselves will get disrupted, giving rise to cumulatively more and more damage to the brain. So it's very, very important that sleep be understood as it is. It is not simply a switching off. It's a very regulated, dynamic, again, well-orchestrated switching off. So things have to switch off in the right sequence, check circuits, switch on, switch off. So it's a whole process which is going on. And disrupting that will obviously have its consequences.
What advice do you give people who stay awake the entire night and try to make up for it during the day? Do you think it is going to have some effect in the future?
It does, because see, people, again, this was something which people started worrying about when the internet happened, because people were expected to work around the clock, or somebody somewhere was working. People realized that all night shifts, even though people could compensate for sleep, ultimately produced health damages. So very, very strict rules were built in as to how many weeks you can stay on a night duty and stay awake all night. Because no matter how much you compensate sleep during the day, the cumulative effect of being outside the circadian, being out of sync with the environmental cycle. So the hormone cycles ultimately get tied into the environment. So you have seasonal patterns and you have day and night patterns, because ultimately we are living in the physical world. So the physical world reflects in that. And if your body is out of sync with the physical world, that can also cause problems. At a very practical level, we find that this kind of night owl behavior ultimately does increase risk for certain kinds of psychiatric disorders at a very simple level. So, people who make a lifetime of being more active during the night and less so during the day becomes a problem.
We are going to touch upon this topic much more in the future. But for now, let's recap. Here are some of the happy chemicals that are released in our brain: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, the level of which may reduce up to 50% if you're depressed. And then there are endorphins, produced and stored in our pituitary gland. Endorphins relieve stress and pain, make us happy, and boost our self-esteem, among other things. The easiest way to get our endorphins up: physical activity. In fact, look at how our brains change with just a simple 20-minute walk. Is there anything that you'd like to add as far as endorphins are concerned?
Endorphins, for example, endorphins and enkephalins were discovered sometime in the 70s by boiling, I think, 20,000 brains of animals to detect a few milligrams of endorphin. They got the Nobel Prize for it because it was a massive, massive exercise. And what it turns out is that the plants around us have already perfected this chemistry. The opium plant produces the same chemical. So the opiate neurotransmitters, so only then we discovered that we have opium-like products inside our own brains, because these drugs act exactly on the opiate receptors, that why people use heroin and things like that. The endorphins and enkephalins, they not only provided us a window into how the brain works, but also how brains evolved. So ultimately, we understand that a lot of the chemicals that we are using in our brain are very simple chemicals produced by plants. And all of us know that, whether it's caffeine, whether it's nicotine, whether it's opium, whether it's cannabis, whether it's alcohol, these are very simple things produced by plants. And in animals, these chemicals have taken on a different role of handling information. Now, within this, the endorphins and enkephalins produce in humans the same degree of satiety, which is triggered by when you're eating too much. So they are satiety indicators. So loss of appetite or increasing appetite was a prominent side effect of the opium. And then you realize that plants evolved this to prevent you from eating too many plants. So it's also a signal when you're eating that these chemicals give you that you've eaten too much.
Mm-hmm.
Satiety, satisfaction, etc., are plant chemical-based signaling that we've incorporated into our brain to control our appetites. Now, that notion of appetite can be extended now into the metaphorical space. So your appetite for stimulation, your appetite for pleasure, but it's the only concept is appetite. So these drugs, endorphins and enkephalins, induce activity, which gives you an appetite for things, which gives you a pleasure, and therefore they are very, very integral to how behavior is regulated. The fact that we've incorporated these from plants is a much deeper philosophical question, but biology is interlinked at many levels.
Again, it's a chicken and egg situation. So in order to stimulate your endorphins, you need to do certain activities, and therefore
Yes.
that's why you're encouraged to, say, exercise.
Yes. Like I mentioned, the idea of the endorphins came up from a time when an animal had to hunt for food or look for the right food. And once it had the food, yes, it is satisfied. So those things are being released. So it's appetitive behavior. Appetitive behavior is always proactive. It is motivated. It has a result. It is something, it gives a sense of pleasure and involvement. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that is a run or whether it is activity. So the human brain has now multiplied its uses. And therefore, but the basic chemistry is the same. The basic chemistry is doing something for which you have an appetite and enjoying it. And the same chemical is now being reused in many, many different contexts. But that's the wonder of the human brain and the mind. And again, with long-term use, with opiates, you find that there's a peculiar listlessness. There's a peculiar disinterest that develops. You know, the old movies, opium dens of China, where people are just sitting around, emaciated, not interested in anything. Because once you replace the genuine appetitive behavior with synthetic appetites, then the genuine one starts to suffer.
So, Doc, we've talked about happy chemicals. But and everything in moderation. Anything which is overdone is bad for health. I want to move on to stress. And I think people have difficulty in understanding why stress and bad stress. Again, I want to specify here that not all stress is bad. In fact, some people thrive in it. I've mentioned it over and over again. But when it's chronic and prolonged, bad stress, that triggers excessive cortisol to be released into our system. And I think it's important for everyone to understand why prolonged stress is bad for health.
So there are two ways to look at this. One is to understand from the physics point of view. Stress is basically a concept from physics. If you bend a steel rod, it will undergo stress, and at a certain particular point, it will actually break. So that's the notion of stress. That stress tolerance for your shock absorbers, for the body of your car, that is the way it is. There also you have two issues. When you have acute stress, when your car actually crashes, and then you have the chronic stress, when aircraft wings break off because they've been experienced to so much stress over a lifetime of takeoffs. Chronic stress can produce equivalent of your wings breaking off in mid-flight or a sudden crash. That's the physics metaphor, simple mechanical engineering metaphor. The other is the biological metaphor, which is that stress can be considered as a kind of readiness of the body, your heartbeat and everything, to undertake what is otherwise known as a fear or a flight or a fun response. Your mind is what will classify this as being fun, flight, or fear. But your heartbeat is still the same. Your steroids are still the same. Your eyeballs, your pupil are still dilated. You still have sweating, but it's your mind which is subclassifying that event as being fun, flight, or fear. If the level of stress arousal doesn't get properly classified into these three, and there's too much of fear and too much of flight, then obviously the fun part of it will disappear. So stress therefore becomes a way in which the human body literally responds to the changing environment. Now, all this process of how the heartbeat is increased and the sweating is increased is a combination of both hormonal responses and neurotransmitter responses. The hormone responses, which is cortisol, basically will prime cells all over the body. It will prime your blood vessels, it will prime your kidney to hold the urine in so that you don't, or if it breaks, you actually pass urine out of sheer fear. So from every single cell of the body, you'll get butterflies in the stomach, you'll get choking in the throat, you'll get palpitation. So steroids will produce a generalized body response. But in the brain, it'll become accompanied by a surge of norepinephrine and dopamine to prepare the brain for a fear or flight. Combining the bodily responses to the brain responses to have a good outcome or a bad outcome is a total response. And if these total responses are negative over and over again, then these processes start shutting down. So brain now is now locked into a particular kind of response. So whenever stress happens, it retreats into a kind of defensive position. Your body starts losing weight, hair starts falling, stomach gets upset, you get chronic diarrheas, you get chronic stomach ache, your body feels fatigued all the time, muscles become more prone to have fasciculation and fidgetiness. So all these are stress responses mediated by cortisol, by the heightened neural activity, and ultimately over a long time, as we've discussed earlier, and which is where we come back to epigenetics, these responses will change the way DNA is expressed in every individual cell. One must understand that genes are inherited at birth. But the classical example I give is that potatoes are produced by vegetative reproduction. Technically, all potatoes should be identical, but you will never find two identical potatoes ever in your life, okay, from the same field.
That's true.
So it means that there is a very local effect of environment, of how each potato is actually different from each other. Genetically, they're identical. They're 100% identical. But no two potatoes are alike, because the local environment will change the way genes are expressed and produce a particular shape. So DNA is a kind of thread that you are giving at birth, but the tapestry you weave is a very different thing. What you weave that DNA into is a very different thing. And that weaving process can be interrupted by anything, by environment, by drugs, by learning. So many things will affect that. And in your brain, in your tissues, all kinds of toxins that we use, which is why some tissues get cancer. So how DNA changes in response to environment, therefore becomes very critical. And epigenetics has a big role in that. It explains part of the cancer, it explains part of behavior and thinking. And therefore, we think it's very, very critical to understand how genes are regulated and respond to stress and environmental issues.
Basically, what you're saying is not all stress is bad. In fact, stress is actually sometimes good for your body. And the stress response is something that is natural, should come natural to our body. It's only when you are exposed over and over and over again to the same stress or prolonged stress. So for instance, if a child is exposed to a parent who is alcoholic, and this is research that has been done at Nimhans, then it affects the epigenetics or the way that child's genes behave. And it makes him or her more susceptible to stress.
You're absolutely right. So the kind of research that we are engaged in, Professor Benegal is the one who's leading this. What we're trying to understand is how events in childhood affect adult behavior. Now, this is a field which has been well studied, and we know all the long-term consequences of childhood trauma, sex abuse, and things like that. So those are very severe events. They have long-term consequences. What we are talking about is something that is perhaps more common and more widespread. For example, when we looked at children from households where the father had alcoholism, we found that the sons were more likely to have, inverted commas, behavior problems at school. They were more likely to have conduct problems, etc., etc. And when given a simple task of doing a simple calculation or reciting something, the cortisol in this saliva went up to a lesser amount, but stayed up for longer than normal children. Normal children, when given a task, the cortisol went up and it came down as they completed the task or felt comfortable. Whereas in these children, it went up less because probably they have been habituated to stress all their life, but stayed up for a longer period. Now, when we looked at the genetics of from their blood, we found that the epigenetic regulators for the serotonin were different. The genetics was not different, but the epigenetic control signals for the serotonin transporter gene, which is one which reuptakes serotonin, were different. So now it gives us a very tenuous link that because of the stress, the way the cells respond to stress is different, and the way serotonin is taken back into the cell after it doing its job as a neurotransmitter is different. And we know that if you manipulate these patterns, networks change. So if you change the speed and the efficiency by which serotonin is being handled in the brain, the circuitry of the brain will change. And that itself can predispose to mental illness. So we found that this was an interesting way to combine the genetics and the life experience into one study. And we now hope to be able to do this on several hundred children over much larger sample sets and much larger, diverse situations, rural, urban, high risk, low risk, education, class, matching all those things to see what factors go in. But this is a very important aspect to understand, because these children are being tested at 12 years of age, 12 or 14 years of age, and the stress had been experienced when they were between 4 and 8. So the fact that this produced changes over a pattern of years becomes very, very important for us, theoretically and practically, because there are lots of things you can do to intervene to make sure that these changes don't happen in the brain, even though they may be a stressful environment.
So, Doc, you're talking about changes in the brain of a child who's exposed to prolonged stress. But
Yes.
I also want to ask you here that not all children behave in the same manner. In fact, some children actually become more resilient. And so
Right.
it could be siblings exposed to a particular stress over and over again, but one sibling becoming more resilient than the other.
You're absolutely right. So we have been looking at this in family studies. So we've got another project in which we look at multiple children from families who have somebody with mental illness, including addiction. Now, those experiments are not progressed enough for us to have definite information, but we do find that if they've had high levels of stress in their childhood, the age at which they begin to have psychiatric problems is reduced by 2 or 3 years. So they develop psychiatric symptoms earlier than expected. This is the most extreme in case of alcoholism, but is equally true of depression, OCD, things like that. So that if there has been stress in the environment in early childhood, if there's a genetic risk for having the disease, then it is likely that you might develop the disease earlier in the presence of stress than those who did not perceive a stress, even in the same family. So the children who experienced stress in the family had an earlier onset of illness. But that's a very broad brushstroke. There are subtle differences in the way this works for boys and girls. Kind of symptoms that develop in boys and girls are also sometimes very different. Girls tend to have more in what we call internalizing symptoms like depression, anxiety, fearfulness. The boys tended to have things like conduct problems, early initiation of cigarette smoking, alcoholism, antisocial behavior. There is some detailing that we are still understanding.
It's a large canvas that we're looking at, but the correlation between our thoughts, emotions, our hormones, and illness. Is there a correlation?
The complicated way to answer is that the human body is an exquisitely designed machine. And all these different mechanisms, whether it's your thoughts, your emotions, the chemicals, or the hormones, they may sound very different levels of reality, but in essence, they are linked to each other. So your hormones do control your moods. How and why, we have no clear idea. Moods also change the hormones. Moods, perceptions also change neurotransmitters. After all, when you listen to music or when you see a piece of art, it is basically a chemical process which is happening all the way from your eyes to your brain. So there are things which are happening. What neuroscientists are talking about is our entire being is a dynamic consciousness, both metaphorically and literally at the biological level. It is literally changing every minute. We sometimes can't keep track of our own thoughts because they are so dynamic. They flow incessantly from one to the other. But once you've said something, it becomes fixed in your head, so that there is a kind of certainty, there's a kind of correctness, there's a kind of appropriateness that your mind is constantly evaluating. Synchrony between hormones, chemicals, structure, function inside a cell to the actual cell, to a synapse, to the neuron, to the circuit of the brain, and to the whole brain, and to your whole soul and body. You can imagine the levels of complexity involved. But there is still, we feel, a connecting thread which we can understand right from the molecules to the actual behavior. That is the golden grail of psychiatry. but hopefully we'll get there. Like in every machine, there are loops at every corner. So thoughts will affect emotion, emotions will affect thought. That's the basic premise of cognitive behavior therapy. They will affect hormones and they will produce changes, which is the whole basis of why exercise improves diabetes. So you're resetting the way your body reacts to insulin, including your brain. How diet control and exercise are critical for controlling diabetes, because then you understand that how exercise and particular kinds of food trigger certain kinds of responses, which worsens or improves your diabetes. Same thing happens with thyroid disease. Same thing happens post-menopause or with hormonal imbalances. One of the typical treatments for PCOD, for example, is just intense physical exercise, because physical exercise triggers hormone cycles in a way that will correct the estrogen cycles, which are contributing to the PCOD. So many of these things get interlinked, which we know by experience, but we still don't know the processes by which this interlinking is happening in the body.
But one sure way to rewire our brains, and you've made this point over and over again, is through some physical activity, because that's the easiest way to do it, through nutrition, looking at your food. So when people talk about nutrition and exercise, it's not just about your body and losing weight. It's about how we influence our hormones and neurotransmitters.
Exactly. Many of the drugs that we use in psychiatry are basically derived from spices. Indian spices or spices all over the world. So whether it's pepper or capsaicin, they got the Nobel Prize last year for discovering how capsaicin works and regulates the brain. And this is what is there in every chili that we eat. So the fact that these chemicals or these processes, which are shared across life forms, can regulate behavior is very well known. But in every animal, they get organized a bit differently. The foods you eat and the chemicals in the foods are reacting with the neurotransmitters in your body to create notion of good food. How does an animal recognize what is good food? Because the chemicals must be in synchrony with other chemicals in the brain. So this whole layers and layers of neurotransmitter signaling, which comes up all the way, then regulates. So the fact that the Chinese recognize that tea improves cardiac function and is long life tea is long life tea. It is an antioxidant. It reduces your blood pressure. It improves health, is from our understanding that diet is what controls the chemicals of your brain. And this has been a part of traditional medicine, Chinese, Ayurvedic, Unani for years. So the diets are what control your brain. Every drug that we use in psychiatry is a plant-based drug. So regulating what goes in from the food, therefore, has a direct impact. I mean, when we were doing experiments as young people, we had to assess serotonin and the metabolites of serotonin in the CSF and the blood. And we can't do it in India because the biggest source of serotonin are beans. And there's no Indian diet which is devoid of beans. In Karnataka, the kadlekai, the broad beans that you get, have such enormous amounts of serotonin that blood levels would be completely different depending on what sambar had been eaten the previous day. Forget depression. The fact that most vegetarian diets will produce humongous amounts of serotonin. Wow. And serotonin is basically produced by your gut bacteria. So serotonin is the major output is from your gut microbiome. So what bacteria you have and what food you eat is going to regulate the amount of serotonin you have in your body. Just about 1% is in your brain. The rest of it is in your gut and being produced by the bacteria and being taken in from the food. So you can imagine how food, the microbiome, what is in your stomach is ultimately going to influence how your brain works.
So your diet affects your brain. This is an ongoing discussion, Doc. It's so interesting and informative and insightful speaking to you. On that note, thank you very much for joining us on Zen-Brain. It's only the first step. I assure you, in future, we want more such discussions that really open our minds. And the point of this discussion really was to show the intricate connection between our thoughts, feelings, or emotions and our hormones. And that's why by changing our thoughts, we can ensure happy emotions. And when that happens, we can release happy chemicals. On the other hand, excessive and prolonged negative thinking, stress, or trauma can in turn affect our bodies negatively and cause a chemical imbalance, or as I've chosen to call it, chemical locha in our body and brain. And an important thing to remember is if there has been past trauma or prolonged exposure to stress, perhaps even on a daily basis, and this may have happened to you as a child, that may have impacted you more than you know. And it may also have impacted the way your genes behave, like in the research that Nimhans has done on children who grew up with an alcoholic parent. This is the first step, once again, in our series to understand this connection, where depression is not just a mood, but it's impacted your brain and body, and that's why it needs treatment like any other illness. Thank you, Dr. Jain, for joining us and for being so insightful.
Glad to be of help.
And all of you, if you have any more questions that you'd like answered, or if there are some specific issues that you want us to talk about and discuss, get in touch with us across our social media handles. Besides our YouTube channel, we are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Or if you're one of those who'd like to email us, also you can do that. That's our email, zenbraintv@gmail.com. See you with another conversation very soon. Thanks for watching.